事我闻。那在今天华尔街论坛节目最后呢，会给大家带来今天的华尔街联报习近平时代如何成为了领袖崇拜空洞无力的一个时代。那黄仁勋为了阻止拜登如何跑断了腿，尽在稍后的华尔街联报。我是小杨，这是和平先生，我们在下一期的华尔街论坛直播再跟大家相见。
大家好，我是华尔街电视的小安，为大家主持一档新的节目《亚洲大眼睛》。什么样的内容，您慢慢看就知道了。10月3日，泰国曼谷市中心暹罗百丽宫 Siam Paragon 发生的枪击事件中，已经造成2人死亡、5人受伤，而其中一名遇害者为中国公民，持续引发关注。10月4日上午，中国遇难者家属就表示，遇难者有2个5岁多的双胞胎女儿，女儿对枪击案尚不知情。所幸的是，该中国公民已经脱离生命危险，正在医院接受治疗。那事发地点是在泰国首都最著名的购物中心之一，游客众多。BBC 中文就报道，有旅游业者就表示，在旅游旺季发生这起重大的治安事件，恐怕直接冲击泰国旅游业复苏的节奏。中国游客却不，这次的枪击案发生在中国黄金周，加上有中国公民死伤，引发中国网民广泛的关注。有微博用户就表示震惊，说道：“看来哪儿都不如中国安全，起码没有枪击案。黑枪交易轻而易举，这样的泰国如何保证游客的安全？”也有网民称，泰国旅游部门针对中国游客免签的一系列举措白瞎了。虽然只是个案，但是他近期肯定不敢去泰国了。那枪击案事发经过，事发后流传的视频就显示，在响起多发的枪声之后，暹罗百丽宫购物中心内的民众纷纷冲向出口逃离。商场内有目击者就表示，事发时他们躲藏在商店和卫生间里。警方在当地时间下午5时10分到达现场，成功解除袭击者武装。当时也有多人受伤，救护车要在繁忙时间交通拥堵的情况下将伤者送往医院。事件中的遇害者分别来自中国和缅甸，而5名伤者中包括1名老挝人、1名中国人和3名泰国人。泰国警方就逮捕了1名14岁的男孩，他是商场附近一所学校的学生，行凶动机不明，但有精神治疗记录，近日曾经停药。那泰国当局宣布成立应急协调中心，处理枪击案的后续事务。泰国非法持枪率高。那泰国的持枪率在邻近地区当中属于偏高，路透社就曾指出，非法持械在这个东南亚国家较为普遍。就在此次的枪案发生1年前，去年10月6日，泰国东北部南摩兰普府也曾经发生枪击案件，袭击者向当地的一家幼儿园进行无差别射杀，造成近40人死亡，而其中多数是儿童。事发后，袭击者驾驶白色皮卡车逃跑，在被警方追捕的过程中，将自己的妻子和孩子杀害后开枪自尽。来自泰国警方的消息就显示，凶手此前为1名警员，因涉毒而被解雇，作案后自杀身亡。警方推断其作案原因与吸食毒品后情绪失控有关。根据多家泰国媒体的报道，这是泰国历史上死亡人数最多的单一肇事者枪击事件。然而这并非泰国首次发生大规模枪击事件。那2020年，泰国1名士兵射杀了他的指挥官，并驾车逃往市区的一处商场，沿途开枪射杀无辜路人。在他进入商场之后，更多的人被枪杀，此事件就造成了30人死亡，数十人受伤。致命枪案凸显枪支管制问题。上述枪案均引发泰国社会关注枪支管制问题。去年的幼儿园枪案发生后，泰国国会下议院警察事务委员会副主席奇帕吉达公就曾表示，警察事务委员会将开会讨论增加民众获取合法枪支的难度，以及要求持枪者每2年到3年更换持枪证。曼谷枪案发生之后，泰国总理塞塔也表示，泰国政府将采取控枪等预防措施，以避免类似的事件再次发生。事实上，泰国枪支暴力和管制问题早已经暴露。泰国警察总署2019年的调查数据就显示，当年泰国境内共发生枪支相关案件超3.14万起， 其中涉案枪支为未登记注册的非法枪支的案件超过 2.43 万起，占案件总数的 77.5%。该文章就指出，泰国的枪支拥有率高得惊人，这得益于枪支许可证发放流程的便捷。在泰国申请和获得枪支许可证很容易，人们可以前往全国900多个地区办事处申请许可证，整个过程不超过86天。那根据澳洲悉尼大学的一个枪支研究项目 gunpolicy.org 称，泰国的枪支法律相对严格，但无阻该国成为拥枪率最高的亚洲国家之一。该项目就指出，如果算上非法持有的枪支，泰国每100人中大约有10支枪，而相对和平的邻国大马每100人中只有不到1支的枪。那在泰国，非法持枪将被处以1至10年的监禁和最高2万泰铢的罚款。枪支登记程序不严格。那泰国批评人士就称，枪支的登记程序还不够严格。泰国发展研究所高级研究员文瓦拉在去年日托中心枪击案发生后写道，泰国惊人的高拥枪率是由于枪支许可证发放过程的便利，在泰国申请和获得枪支许可证非常的容易。他补充，对于枪支宽松的法律和政策表明，泰国社会对枪支暴力的容忍度很高。那东南亚枪杀案第2高，泰国发展研究所官网去年10月12日发布的文章中就指出，泰国拥有超过1030万支的枪支，平民枪支拥有率为每100人 15.1 支，为东盟第1，亚洲第2高，仅次于巴基斯坦。与此同时，泰国射枪死亡总数在东盟国家中排名第2，仅次于菲律宾，为2804人，枪支相关死亡率为每10万人 3.91 人。那世界上有哪些国家可以合法持有枪支？全世界200多个国家和地区中，绝大多数是不允许公民私人持有枪支的。不过，也有些国家在允许公民满足一定的条件的前提下合法持枪。可能说到允许公民合法持枪的国家，最先被想到的就是美国。这主要是美国频繁发生的枪击案给世人造成的印象。2017年，美国共发生枪击案事件60091起，共造成15182人死亡，30619人受伤。这其中大规模的枪击事件有338起。那么世界上是不是就只有这个国家允许公民合法持枪呢？其实除了美国之外，俄罗斯、日本、德国、英国、法国、加拿大、瑞士、冰岛、丹麦、芬兰、意大利、西班牙、葡萄牙、比利时、荷兰、塞尔维亚、捷克、以色列、哥伦比亚、巴拿马、智利、玻利维亚、南非、摩纳哥、阿根廷、挪威、墨西哥、巴西、菲律宾、泰国、巴基斯坦等30多个国家都允许公民在满足一定条件的前提下合法持有枪支。那全世界200多个国家和地区中，只有30多个允许公民合法持枪，确实不算多。但细心的人可能发现，允许公民合法持枪的国家中，欧洲国家占了大部分，所以合法持枪这件事情在欧洲其实并不是什么罕见的事。那么许多允许公民持枪的国家，是不是也像美国一样频发枪击案呢？事实上，绝大多数允许公民合法持枪的国家，并没有出现像美国那样枪击案频发的现象。那当然，巴西、墨西哥等几个治安不大好的国家是例外。那观众朋友们，您认为泰国的合法持枪制度到底好不好呢？欢迎留言告诉我们，谢谢大家。这就是第22期亚洲大眼睛，希望听到您的意见。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。大约1年前，拜登政府开始限制美国企业向中国出售高端芯片，现在他又开始起草额外的限制措施，主要目的还是阻止北京在军事领域的进步。但是最近几个月，随着美国芯片公司不断发出警告，拜登政府不得不放缓了限制中国的脚步。美国芯片巨头都表示，削减对中国的销售将会损害美国企业的业务，并且破坏拜登在美国建造半导体产业链的雄心壮志。自从7月份以来，全球3大芯片制造商英伟达、英特尔和高通一直强调，打击中国将产生意想不到的后果。 他们一直在游说政客，并且敦促华盛顿重新考虑芯片控制措施。这些公司警告，美国退出中国市场可能会加速中国独立芯片产业的发展，为中国制造的芯片未来主导世界反而是铺平了道路。对于这一点，英伟达的法律顾问蒂姆·泰特解释，美国产品退出中国市场的风险是刺激由竞争对手主导的生态系统的发展，这可能会对美国在半导体、先进技术和人工智能领域的领导地位产生非常负面的影响。两位知情人士表示，三大芯片巨头的游说活动导致了白宫新限制措施的推迟，并且缩小了拜登政府可能做出的改变的范围。负责制定规则的商务部则表示，出口管制出台的时机和限制范围将会经过精心的设计，以产生最大的效果。但是，芯片三巨头试图取消对华限制的举动也激怒了一些美国的安全专家、立法者和他们的竞争对手。许多人还是赞成与中国政府相对抗，同时他们很不满意这些芯片巨头一边是拿着白宫刚刚发布的100亿美元芯片补贴，一边又叫拜登不能打击中国。而美国2022年出台的芯片补贴法案正是为了对抗中国而提供的资金支持。美国芯片三大巨头现在的态度也正说明了美国国家安全与商业利益之间的紧张关系，凸显了拜登政府一个无法回避的窘境，那就是由于美国和中国在经济上的相互依存已经有几十年了，这也就意味着华盛顿采取任何行动对抗北京都有可能给自己造成伤害。中国约占全球半导体市场的1/3，英伟达、英特尔和高通在中国的年收入总和超过500亿美元。他们警告，失去这些收入可能会迫使他们削减技术研发经费，减少美国的工作岗位，以及削减在亚利桑那州、俄亥俄州和纽约州半导体工厂的开支。去年，拜登签署芯片补贴法案后不久，就于10月7号颁布了对华销售的限制措施。业界当时第一反应也默认了这些措施，芯片公司纷纷调整业务，比如说英伟达为了符合限制要求，为中国开发了一款专门适用于中国市场的人工智能芯片 H100， 把这款芯片的性能都降低到了规定允许的最高水平之下。但是限制带来的损失也在增加，中国禁止销售美国芯片公司美光科技的产品。与此同时，华盛顿的安全专家则发现了限制措施的一些漏洞，开始质疑英伟达为中国生产专供芯片是否违背了限制措施的精神。今年7月份有传言称，美国政客即将扩大对中国的限制，禁止英伟达销售专门为中国开发的人工智能芯片。两位行业高管表示，他们现在担心拜登政府还可能针对英伟达和英特尔向中国浪潮集团销售芯片。浪潮集团呢，是一家有军方背景的中国大数据云计算公司。或者拜登政府还可能针对高通向中国电信巨头华为出售4G 移动芯片。高通目前则拥有向华为供货的特别许可。最近三巨头的 CEO， 也就是英特尔的帕特基辛格、英伟达的黄仁勋和高通的阿蒙，都前往了华盛顿与政府官员会面。他们分别会见了布林肯、雷蒙多和沙利文，向政府解释失去中国市场的代价，并且警告说这可能迫使美国削减开支。两位熟悉英特尔内部活动的消息人士称，会谈气氛比较紧张。在与白宫官员的对话当中呢，英特尔官员还质疑国家安全委员会的助手是否真正了解半导体技术。这些公司还敦促他们的贸易组织半导体行业协会来发表声明，批评政府的限制是广泛、模糊而且单方面的，并且警告进一步的限制将会损害美国半导体行业的竞争力。除了试图说服政府官员之外呢，三大芯片公司还扩大了针对智库研究人员的活动。今年夏天，英伟达的黄仁勋就会见了以安全为重点的智库战略与国际研究中心 CSIS 和大西洋理事会等组织的领导人。4位知情人士表示，英伟达对智库的积极行动引起了一些警惕。华盛顿传出消息称，英伟达对战略与国际研究中心的高级研究主任艾伦的研究提出了质疑，而艾伦是支持对华出口限制的。而在英伟达与这家智库的筹款人讨论捐款期间，有几位政策圈的人士打电话给这家智库，称英伟达试图利用其影响力排挤研究主任艾伦。最终呢，战略与国际研究中心称，英伟达是向该智库捐赠了6.5万美元， 不到其年度捐款的1%。智库还表示，英伟达的行为并无不当之处。而就在我们节目录制的当天10月6号，艾伦还在 CSIS 的网站上发表了一篇长篇研究报告，题为《华为新款智能手机与半导体出口管制的未来》。在这篇文章当中，他仍然呼吁要收紧对华管制。他说，中国仍然在从韩国等其他公司那里获取重要的技术，因此他提出，现在的出口管制需要扩大到包括韩国、德国，最好是整个欧洲。英伟达的法律顾问则声明，从来没有对艾伦的研究工作提出过异议。那么，除了与白宫官员和智库专家会面游说之外，芯片三巨头的努力还包括与谷歌的前首席执行官兼董事长施密特会面。施密特为什么如此重要呢？因为自2018年卸任谷歌董事长以来，他已经成为华盛顿的实权人物。他在美国国防部的2个咨询委员会任职，并且资助他自己的一个智库，叫做特殊竞争力研究项目。同时，施密特还支持限制中国获得美国设计的半导体。在7月中旬，基辛格、阿蒙和黄仁勋与施密特谈论了芯片限制的弊端。上个月，施密特的智库则邀请基辛格和黄仁勋在华盛顿举行了一次关于国家安全和技术的年度会议上进行了一场炉边谈话。但是在这场谈话中，2位高管都没有提到关于半导体限制和中国的问题。那么目前在芯片三巨头中，最年轻的英伟达反而是市值最高的公司，并且它已经跻身万亿美元俱乐部，市值是其他同行的2倍多。分析师预计，英伟达本财年的销售额将会增长1倍多，达到545亿美元，很可能可以超过英特尔和高通。而英伟达的规模要比这2家公司小得多，因此这是一个十分惊人的成长速度。英伟达是如何在短短几年内从一家高端游戏芯片公司发展成为人工智能巨头，并且如今有了可以游说政府的能力呢？英伟达专门从事图形处理器 GPU 的芯片设计，通常适用于在电脑端上玩的高要求的电子游戏。长期以来，这一直是英伟达的核心业务，而且利润颇丰。英伟达在发展过程中发现这些 GPU 也适用于其他要求苛刻的任务，例如加速中央处理器的计算性能，而这一点尤其受到谷歌、微软和亚马逊的青睐，他们的云计算和消费互联网服务急需这一能力。于是这一市场的出现令电子游戏市场黯然失色。英伟达数据中心的年收入从2016财年的 3.39 亿美元激增到去年的150多亿美元，而此时英伟达才是刚刚起步。而随着去年人工智能聊天机器人 ChatGPT 的出现，它普及了生成式人工智能的理念，科技公司们很快就看到了这其中的潜力。而此时，英伟达正好拥有最适合训练人工智能模型的芯片。英伟达最新的季度报告显示，尽管严重的供应链短缺导致出货量要远低于需求，但是英伟达数据中心的收入在短短3个月内增长了1倍多。分析师预计，下一财年它的数据中心收入将会突破600亿美元，是去年水平的4倍多。而到了这一步，英伟达开始拥有了与其他芯片巨头平起平坐的强大优势。而在另一方面，光有芯片这种硬件，没有软件的话，硬件就无法工作。在这一点上，黄仁勋是有先见之明的。早在2006年，英伟达就发布了 CUDA， 翻译为计算统一设备架构。这是一种允许开发人员为 GPU 编写应用程序的编程语言。它后来被证明是英伟达人工智能业务的一个关键基石。它允许工程师和科学家对 GPU 进行编程。今年5月份，黄仁勋说，仅去年 CUDA 的下载量就达到了2500万次，是该软件推出至今下载量的2倍多。CUDA 也为英伟达提供了一条竞争对手难以跨越的护城河。英伟达称这款软件是它剑带中的一支关键的剑，它真正使英伟达在竞争中脱颖而出。英伟达表示，未来几年它的系统的大部分性能改进将是软件驱动的，而不是硬件驱动的。现在人工智能的概念对于科技公司来说诱惑太大，以至于科技巨头都在争相试图自己来研发芯片。而英伟达的最大客户亚马逊、微软和谷歌也都拥有自己的内部团队，任务就是设计自己的芯片。在今天，路透社就独家报道 ，ChatGPT 的拥有者 OpenAI 也在打造自己的 AI 芯片。 因为现在英伟达的芯片实在是太稀缺了。英伟达控制着全球人工智能芯片80%以上的市场。英伟达的成功秘诀在于保持其硬件和软件的整体性能足够强大。它的自身经历告诉我们，没有哪家科技公司是会永远屹立于不败之地的。像当年英特尔将自己的 GPU 与自家生产的电脑 CPU 整合在一起的时候，英伟达曾经一度面临生存威胁。在那个时候，英特尔当时的年收入是英伟达的10倍，而现在却即将被英伟达反超。英伟达的成功可能是听取了英特尔前老板的建议，那就是只有偏执狂才能生存。从这一点上，我们也能看到为什么今天英伟达为了说服拜登政府减少对华限制，如此不遗余力。以上就是今天新风视线的全部内容，感谢您的收看。这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢，记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道。我们下期节目再见。
我们往往会忘记，在20世纪60年代，美国正式送往月球的人数要多于送往中国的人数。在那个时代，毛泽东领导下的人民共和国似乎不仅是超凡脱俗的，而且是半形而上学的，是仅凭胡须证据在头脑中构建的东西。中国就像是香格里拉。我第一次亲眼看到中国是在1966年秋天，当时香港的朋友带我越过殖民地的北部边界，来到深圳，当时是一个农业村落，现在是中国第4大城市。能看到一头水牛，我觉得自己很幸运。在西方人中，只有少数特权旅行者获准进入。中国比利时小说和回忆录作家韩素因和英国记者费利克斯·格林、小说家格雷厄姆·格林的堂兄就是其中之一。对于我们这些远道而来的局外人来说，这些作家的文字熠熠生辉，不仅因为他们的稀缺，还因为他们令人振奋。他们证明香格里拉是真实的。现在回想起来，人们可能会责怪作者们没有提及20世纪50年代初土地改革期间的枪决之余，也没有提及1959至62年那场令人匪夷所思的大饥荒，但这是不公平的。在政府导游的陪同下旅行，他们对这些事实一无所知。他们对美好的外表信以为真，就像我在外面对他们美好的言辞信以为真一样。我们的错误是相似的。1967年，作者与一名来自中国大陆的难民在香港北部边境眺望深圳。20世纪70年代，代表团可以前往中国。1972年4月，在理查德·尼克松对中国进行破冰访问2个月后，中国乒乓球代表团访问美国，我是代表团的翻译。1973年5月，北京为我们提供了回访机会，我们兴奋不已。但是，长达1个月的旅程让我对香格里拉的印象出现了一些裂痕。我不明白为什么铁路乘客要按等级分类，官员和外国人做软卧，其他人做硬座。导游解释说，官员有负担，他们需要休息。在唐山市附近，我们一行人下到了煤矿深处，在那里，小型轨道车在光线昏暗的隧道中穿行，但在地球表面随处可见的毛主席语录却不见踪影，鲜红的背景上闪烁着金色或白色的字迹。当我向导游询问此事时，他似乎有点不高兴。他回答说，太脏了。对我来说，这真是个晴天霹雳。矿井里的污垢对工人来说没问题，但对他们领导人的思想就不行了。1976年毛泽东逝世后的几年里，中国开放的大门越开越大。主要在香港工作的西方记者现在可以到北京工作了。福克斯·巴特菲尔德为《纽约时报》在北京开设了分社，理查德·伯恩斯坦为《时代周刊》，梅琳达·刘为《新闻周刊》，杰伊和琳达·马修斯分别为《华盛顿邮报》和《洛杉矶时报》撰稿。这些作家和其他作家的作品不仅比毛泽东时代的中国新闻更深入，而且范围也更广。对读者来说，这就像是从地摊搬到了超市。20世纪80年代，西方研究生和学者可以在中国逗留数月或整年，利用图书馆和档案馆，有时甚至进行调查或实地工作。能够沉入生活是一个重要的不同。1979-80学年，我在北京和广州学习中国当代文学，发现下半年学到的东西比上半年多得多。这并不稀奇。 沉下心来就会产生复利。20世纪80年代初，我了解到，持不同政见的作家，如震撼人心的揭露小说人，还是妖怪的作者刘宾彦，虽然在某种意义上处于社会的边缘，但实际上却是最真实的揭示了社会内核的人。正是因为他们敢于直面核心，才被推向边缘。而那些在主流社会中茁壮成长的作家，则是通过不关注主流社会来实现的。1989年6·4屠杀的冲击，暂时停止了西方与中国的学术交流，也使国际记者的工作条件变得更加困难。不过，在随后的20年里，在江泽民和胡锦涛的执政下，外国学者和记者重返中国，工作条件也变得更加规范。记者们逐渐习惯了他们必须遵守的规则，以及规避这些规则的方法和风险。学术交流从集中的国家项目转向学者个人与其实验室之间的联系。在2012年开始的习近平时代，中方继续寻求从西方获得技术知识，但其他领域的知识交流却有所减少。作为红二代，习近平上台后深谙在中国共产党系统内升迁所需的伎俩，但除此之外，他视野狭窄，缺乏魅力，而且只受过初中教育，他的大专学历只是纸上谈兵。他认为自己从胡锦涛手中接过的国家形势岌岌可危，需要有所作为。但做什么呢？由于无法预见其他选择，他转向了他所知道的唯一模式，即毛泽东模式。他对毛泽东思想的唯一重大偏离，就是自称代表了伟大而古老的中华文明。就这样，伟大领袖的外衣再次落到了中国人民的头上，权力重新集中到一个人的手中，而偶像崇拜最高领袖的华丽辞藻和口头禅又卷土重来，习近平思想、习近平文集、新时代、核心领导力等等。今年早些时候，全国人民代表大会以2952票对0票选举习近平第3次连任。林彪1967年对红卫兵的注明只是读毛主席的著作，听毛主席的话，执行毛主席的只是又被逐字逐句地搬了出来，只是习字取代了毛字。对于西方中国观察家来说，他们自己所受到的待遇放大了他们对毛泽东的反感，签证被拒，旅行受限，线人受到恐吓。我们是否又回到了起点？没有。现在西方关于中国的报道已大不相同，少数作家仍在坚持不懈地为北京辩护，尽管这需要智力上的扭曲。但即使是他们，也不会像50年前的毛泽东那样对习近平充满惊奇和敬畏。今天，西方人可能会因为签证被拒而感到沮丧，而在当时，一想到签证，就会像萤火虫的尾巴一样，在黑暗中闪闪发光。当年来自中国的信息点点滴滴，如今信息和网络评论如滔滔江水。但更重要的是，中国本身也发生了变化。在毛泽东时代，所有公共媒体、黑板报、扩音器、会议、广播、杂志、学校课程、书籍中的信息都是自上而下单向流动的。一个人的平台仅限于他或他没有麦克风的声音，在最糟糕的时候，即使在家庭内部说出自己的想法也是危险的。如今，网络和信息平台比比皆是，你可以随意嘲讽习近平，只要你私下进行，没有组织。但与此同时，共产党也投入巨资对人们进行电子监控和恐吓，其结果可能最终会变成谁知道呢？一种令人窒息的技术法西斯主义，甚至会超出乔治·奥威尔的想象。我并不是说现在的情况更美好，只是说情况不同了。请看这样一个例子：1970年3月5日，北京的教师奉命带领学生前往位于北京朝阳区的工人体育场，目睹敢于批评共产党的27岁作家于洛可被枪决，子弹击中后脑勺。2023年6月15日，在同一个体育场，一名18岁的中国足球迷跑进球场拥抱阿根廷球星梅西。在安保人员的追赶下，这名年轻人绕场1周，跑过了体能较差的安保人员。人群为他欢呼，高喊着牛逼牛逼。毛泽东时代的群众做梦也想不到会这样。习近平和毛泽东都追求思想统一，但取得的结果却大相径庭。在毛泽东时代，人们通常相信自己喊出的话，而在习近平时代， 人们往往通过外在表现来保护自己的利益。2002年，刘晓波写了一篇辛辣的文章《一个欺骗良知的民族》，其中他观察到江泽民是如何利用毛泽东的语言，在全社会对法轮功实施团结的。江泽民只是在表面上实现了统一，但这正是他所需要的。从统治者的角度来看，不敢说不恨法轮功的民众和恨法轮功的民众一样好。刘晓波在文章的最后问，一个强加统一思想的政权和一个要求统一谎言的政权，哪个更可怕？习近平是否意识到他的民众支持在刘晓波看来是空洞的？毫无疑问，他知道，否则他的政府为何要花费巨资进行维稳，包括对那些思想可能只是可能挑战其权力的人进行精细监控，无论他们多么和平。习近平的不安全感既体现在权力金字塔的顶端，也体现在底层。一个有自信的领导人是否需要站在华丽盛装的中心，宣称我有自信？不过，从1949年到现在，还是有一些不变的东西。对毛泽东和习近平来说，党对权力的掌控和他们自己对个人权力的掌控都是最优先的事项。意识形态、经济、台湾、历史遗产和其他问题都是次要的。这种优先地位不会改变，这是制度的公理。同样不变的是，外国观察家很少注意到的一种社会状况，尽管它是巨大的，而且一直存在。这就是人们的生活充满了日常关切、食物、家庭、健康、天气等等，而不是习近平思想或类似的东西。当一个普通公民有政治想法时，更可能是关于如何应对地方官员的欺凌。自下而上的人民生活与自上而下的国家利益之间的鸿沟，在毛泽东时代的中国就已存在，并一直延续至今。从普通百姓到最高官员，个人思想中也存在着这样的缝隙。我如何在体制内正常工作，和我如何得到我想要的东西，这两个问题很少有相同的答案。这两种计算模式并行存在，随着时间的推移和习惯的养成，他们的共存似乎变得极为正常。研究当代中国的西方作家常常把中国共产党的官方语言当作中国想要什么或在想什么。在亨利·基辛格 （Henry Kissinger） 长达630页的《论中国》一书中，很难让人感觉到作者甚至知道中国本土思想的存在，更不用说其中包含的内容了。西方人最近出版的其他书籍的封面往往标榜作者在中国生活多年或去过中国数十次，然而通常情况下，书中的文字只关注接缝的一面。正如中国的老生常谈所说，作者隔靴搔痒。当然，对中国问题分析师来说，去中国总比不去好，但经常无法进入靴子内部的情况表明，阻碍他们去中国的不仅仅是签证问题，语言是一大障碍。关于中国的书籍通常由分析家撰写，基辛格并非孤立他们只阅读英文译本，通过翻译或与讲英语的中国官员进行访谈。而能够用中文听、读、说和思考的中国观察家则大不相同。我们也许会问，是北京的作家用英语采访，还是新西兰的作家用中文阅读，谁更接近中国？自20世纪50年代以来，最善于越界的西方中国观察家都擅长中文。Laszlo Ledeny 神父他的通讯《中国新闻分析》于1953年至1982年间出版，翻阅了中国官方报刊。用作家吴祖祥的话说，他可以倒着读。如果拉丹尼读到英勇的解放军战士在合肥附近救出了13名矿工，他就知道合肥附近很可能发生了灾难性的矿井坍塌。后来，西蒙、莱斯、格雷米、巴梅和迈克尔·舍恩哈尔斯都向人们展示了进入汉语世界如何带来巨大的不同。伊恩·约翰逊 （Ian Johnson） 在其新书《火花》（Sparks） 中，完全从接缝处的本土角度进行写作。我怀疑上一段提到的中国人会对中国观察家这个标签感到很舒服。这个词意味着一种从远处看问题的视角，一种专注于政府政策的视角，但恰恰是对这种视角的超越，才使得文化熏陶下的中国观点如此宝贵。中国问题专家和中国问题分析家也有类似的问题，更不用说中国问题老手了。1966年我第一次去香港时， 中国问题老手一词还存在。中国人称西方人为中国通，即对中国了如指掌的人，几乎总是带有讽刺意味。它要么是一种温和的贬低，要么是一个玩笑。谁都知道，西方人不可能对中国了如指掌。太多时候，中国共产党的官方语言被当作中国想要什么或认为什么来传播。在回顾60年来西方人对中国的报道时，我们也可以注意到中国人对西方的看法是如何转变的。1950年，朝鲜战争爆发，毛泽东发起了抗美援朝运动。然而，这种态度在普通中国人的生活中究竟有多深，目前尚不清楚。大约从100年前开始，美国就已经是美丽的国家了。该词并非源于美的概念，而是因为美国一词的第二个音节，但同音异义词在中国文化中很有分量，因此这个音本身就是美国形象的一个偶然开端。此外，到20世纪70年代末，美国已成为中国现代化的典型代表。20世纪80年代，我不得不努力说服年轻的中国人，让他们认识到美国也有缺点。近年来出现了一股反美浪潮，其中一些是国家支持的。20年前，中共开始向在互联网上发表每条反美言论的人支付5毛钱半块人民币，囚犯可以因此获得津贴，甚至提前释放。但其他反西方的谩骂是发自内心的，是基于民族自豪感和与西方的竞争，而非仇恨。例如，今年4月，宝马公司员工在上海的一次车展上被拍到向外国人而非中国人免费赠送冰激凌，引起了全国骚动。在更深的层面上，一些长期以来将美国视为民主典范的中国知识分子感到了一些幻灭。2020年1月6日，在美国国会大厦发生的叛乱，使美国民主的基础似乎没有以前那么牢固，而精英阶层坚持政治正确的做法，也让其他人想起了文化大革命。外部压力说你必须相信 X， 如果你不相信，你就需要从自己的内心寻找原因，然后忏悔，然后改正，这令人不寒而栗。简而言之，后毛泽东时代中国人对西方的看法，有时与西方人对中国的看法一样盲目。双方在大洋彼岸看待对方时，都过多地利用了自己的背景，但这是很自然的，我们不应气馁。今天，西方关于共产主义中国的写作虽然仍有缺陷，但比60年前要好得多。
On August 29th, Huawei launched its new Mate60 Pro smartphone. Normally, smartphone launches do not attract attention in U.S. national security circles. However, this one did, and rightfully so. The Mate60 Pro dramatically marked Huawei's return to the 5G smartphone business after years of ever-tightening U.S. Department of Commerce export controls effectively cut Huawei off from 5G technology. How? By restricting Huawei's access to U.S. semiconductor technology, especially chips, chip design software, and chip-making equipment. The mobile application processor chip at the heart of the new Huawei phone has an integrated 5G modem. The chip was designed by Huawei's HiSilicon subsidiary and manufactured by a Chinese company, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, SMIC. In March 2023, China's government reportedly made Huawei and SMIC, along with two leading Chinese semiconductor equipment companies, Advanced Microfabrication Equipment, AMEC, and NORA, the heart of a new government initiative for semiconductor self-reliance. Huawei is effectively the leader of the Chinese government-backed team, with a privileged position to influence semiconductor policymaking. SMIC manufactured the new chips at the advanced 7nm (nm) technology node, and +2 in SMIC process naming conventions, raising questions in U.S. national security circles about whether the effectiveness of U.S. technology export controls on Huawei, and perhaps China more broadly, is coming to an end. That was certainly the message that China wanted to send. Chinese state-run media outlets were exuberant, arguing in editorials that Huawei's new phone shows how ineffective Washington's tech sanctions have been and that extreme suppression by the U.S. has failed. The new phone was announced during Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo's visit to China, which placed a double emphasis on the phone's significance toward U.S. export controls. However, there is a big difference between claiming that Chinese technological progress proves the current approach to export controls is not achieving all of its desired effects and claiming that Chinese technological progress proves that those same export controls are strategically useless. In principle, either might or might not be true, but the former does not inherently imply the latter. In the case of the 7nm chip powering the new Mate60 smartphone, this is a legitimate breakthrough on China's part, not in terms of reaching the global state-of-the-art, but in continuing to make technological progress despite U.S. and allied restrictions. The Trump administration's entity list-based export controls on Huawei and its primary chip manufacturer SMIC had explicitly sought to prevent Huawei and SMIC from designing and manufacturing chips more advanced than 10 nanometers and from producing 5G chips. The same is true of the Biden administration's October 7, 2022, semiconductor export control policy, which restricted exports to China of, among other things, advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment. While the Huawei phone is not itself a major national security issue for the United States, what the chip inside signals about the state of the Chinese semiconductor industry absolutely is. The 7nm chips at the heart of the new Huawei phone provide many data points regarding the current and likely future state of the Chinese semiconductor industry. In short, China is still not at the global state-of-the-art for semiconductor manufacturing, but the gap between the peak technological level of China and that of the rest of the world has shrunk, even despite the many hurdles that the U.S. government has attempted to place in SMIC's way. These advanced chip production capabilities will inevitably be made available to the Chinese military if they have not been already.
Thus, the Huawei and SMIC breakthrough raises many tough questions about the efficacy of the current U.S. approach.
In fairness to the Biden administration, however, their desired approach, a multilateral one, has only just begun. This paper will analyze the strategic implications of the Huawei Mate60 Pro and its SMIC 7nm chip in the context of U.S. and allied export controls on the two companies and on China more generally.
It concludes by presenting a list of tough questions where U.S. and allied country policymakers urgently need answers. Title 1: Background on the Trump administration export controls on Huawei and SMIC. In Washington, Huawei is mostly known for its telecommunications infrastructure business, but the company was at the forefront of China's remarkable rise in the smartphone, computer, and artificial intelligence (AI) semiconductor chip design industry during the 2010s. In late 2018, there were only two companies in the world selling smartphones with 7nm mobile application processors, Apple and Huawei, both of which designed the chips in-house and outsourced manufacturing to the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. The original stated intention of adding Huawei to the entity list in May 2019 was to punish the company for selling technology to Iran in violation of U.S. sanctions, and especially for repeatedly lying to U.S. officials, destroying evidence, and otherwise trying to obstruct justice. The U.S. government also expressed a broader goal of preventing the company from using U.S. technology in ways that contradicted U.S. national security interests. The national security issue was initially focused on Huawei's business in 5G telecommunications infrastructure, not smartphones. However, the national security focus grew to include ensuring that Huawei did not use U.S. technology to assist it in evading the reach of U.S. export controls, which thereafter led to a more generalized focus on Huawei's activities related to chip design and chip manufacturing, including for base stations and smartphones. As described in a previous size paper, the 2019 U.S. export controls on Huawei, as well as the earlier April 2018 export controls on Chinese telecom firm ZTE, were a landmark in the Chinese national security policy community.
China's pursuit of semiconductor self-sufficiency had already been a top Chinese industrial policy priority from the Made in China 2025 policy of 2015 and even earlier with China's establishment of its Big Fund in 2014. However, after 2018, semiconductor self-sufficiency became a top Chinese national security priority, not just an industrial policy one. Semiconductor self-sufficiency received more than $100 billion in Chinese government financial support and regularly attracted the personal attention of Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping. De-Americanization of the supply chain became a priority not just for Huawei and the Chinese government, but also for many leading Chinese chipmakers. For example, in May 2021, Nikkei Asia reported that Yangtze Memory Technologies Corporation, YMTC, one of China's most advanced semiconductor manufacturers, had already been engaged in a full-blown de-Americanization campaign involving the full-time work of more than 800 staff for 2 years.
This included the establishment of multiple major partnerships with domestic Chinese equipment producers.
Industry sources told SAIS that YMTC also conducted a close examination of the foreign sources within the supply chain of U.S. equipment manufacturers and launched an effort to begin direct purchases from the foreign suppliers of U.S. firms. In May 2020, the Department of Commerce concluded that the 2019 Huawei entity listing had an effect but failed to achieve its goals. U.S. chip manufacturers such as Intel, Qualcomm, and Xilinx continued selling many types of advanced chips directly to Huawei, as many of their chips were not produced in the United States and therefore were not subject to the export controls as written at the time. More importantly, however, Huawei was successfully designing replacement chips, using U.S. chip design software, and contracting with chip foundries outside of China to manufacture them, in facilities that relied heavily on U.S. chip manufacturing equipment. Industry sources told SAIS that U.S. companies were losing revenue not as a direct result of no longer selling to Huawei, but rather because Huawei was replacing U.S. chips with their own self-designed versions. Then Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross put it this way: despite the entity list actions the department took last year, Huawei and its foreign affiliates have stepped up efforts to undermine these national security-based restrictions through an indigenization effort. However, that effort is still dependent on U.S. technologies. The May 2020 updated export controls therefore applied a revised version of the Foreign Direct Product Rule, FDPR, to prevent foreign entities from assisting Huawei and its chip design subsidiary HiSilicon in designing or manufacturing chips that were a direct product of U.S. technology. Overnight, Huawei's access to semiconductors shrank drastically to only 3 sources, the less technologically advanced subset of chips for which U.S. licenses were still being approved, the vast set of U.S. and foreign chips that were manufactured or assembled outside of the United States and were therefore not subject to the U.S. rules, and the enormous stockpile of critical chips that Huawei had amassed by making purchases when they were still legal.
The Chinese chip manufacturers that were still willing to work with Huawei generally had dramatically inferior technology. Even the initial application of the FDPR in May 2020 did not affect chips produced outside of the United States, with the exception of those designed by HiSilicon. This allowed Huawei to engage in a massive stockpiling effort. Then, the Trump administration decided to finally cut off Huawei's access to chips and updated the FDPR in August of 2020 to apply not only to Huawei and HiSilicon's own chips but to all chips produced using U.S. technology that was being sold to Huawei. Despite Huawei's stockpiling, the May and August 2020 controls eventually did serious damage. Huawei's worldwide revenue declined 28.5% between 2020 and 2021.
The damage was especially severe in Huawei's smartphones business, which required a much higher volume of advanced chips and was essentially cut off from 5G technology. Early in 2023, Huawei told its investors that it optimistically hoped to sell a mere 30 million phones that year, an 88% decline from the 240 million it sold in 2019.
Huawei had to take dramatic steps, such as selling off the majority of its consumer smartphone business to a new spin-off known as Honor, as well as its Intel-based x86 server business, which is now known as Xfusion.
These moves allowed Huawei to conserve its massive chip stockpile for more strategic parts of its business such as network infrastructure and premium smartphone products. The Mate60 Pro marks Huawei's return to the 5G smartphone business and thereby proves that the effects of the Trump-era controls are rapidly coming to an end as Huawei redesigns its supply chain to rely more on its HiSilicon subsidiary for chip design and more on SMIC, as opposed to TSMC of Taiwan, for manufacturing. Huawei's revised sales projections for 2023 suggest that it expects to sell roughly 40 million smartphones in 2023, of which roughly half will use the new 7nm chips. Industry analysts with ties to Huawei's supply chain report that Huawei expects to sell 60 million smartphones in 2024, of which most or all will use Huawei-designed, SMIC-manufactured mobile application processors with integrated 5G modems. The Mate60 Pro's memory chips are manufactured by SK hynix of South Korea. SK hynix has stated that it stopped doing business with Huawei after the introduction of U.S. sanctions and that it is investigating how Huawei came to use its chips. Though selling 60 million smartphones would still be a significant decrease from Huawei's 2019 peak, it likely signals the start of a comeback for the company. The sophistication of the Huawei chip from a design perspective, it is at least equal to and often better than the best Western-designed smartphone chips of the 7nm era, indicates that there has been no significant erosion in HiSilicon's design excellence. Moreover, Huawei's integration of the 5G modem onto the same silicon die as the mobile application processor brings many technological performance benefits. Huawei has achieved this 3 years before Apple currently expects to do so. Radio frequency engineering, the critical technology involved in developing modems, is the technical core of Huawei's business, and industry sources told SIZE that Huawei is far ahead of most companies in this space. While this supply chain is still critically dependent upon U.S. technology, some of the pre-October 2022 export controls and entity list restrictions on Huawei suppliers were not especially well designed for a goal of blocking SMIC from producing 7nm chips, despite that being their explicit goal. For example, the Entity List License Review Policy for SMIC established in December 2020 states that license applications to export to SMIC will be reviewed under a policy of presumption of denial for items uniquely required for production of semiconductors at advanced technology nodes, 10 nanometers and below, including extreme ultraviolet technology, case by case for all other items. The problem with this standard is the uniquely required phrase. This is both vague and a poor fit for the reality of semiconductor manufacturing. Nearly all semiconductor manufacturing equipment that can be used to produce 10 nanometers and below chips can also be used to produce less advanced 14 nanometers and above chips and vice versa. This is known as CAPEX recycling by the semiconductor industry, and industry sources told SIZE that equipment reuse rates between these nodes are sometimes higher than 90%. Furthermore, the rules only applied to U.S. origin items and technology which did not include a major portion of semiconductor capital equipment produced by U.S. firms outside of the United States in locations such as Singapore and Malaysia. In some cases, the companies did not even need to apply for a license, as their equipment was not technically U.S. origin and was therefore not even subject to the rules. The companies applying for export licenses simply stated this truth in their export license applications, at which point the Department of Commerce frequently approved them. Department of Commerce license application reviewers are, understandably, trained to follow the letter of the law, even if that law's text is a poor fit for what department leadership describes as the goal of that law. According to a Reuters analysis of Department of Commerce documents, 113 export licenses worth $61 billion were approved for suppliers to ship products to Huawei, HWT.UL, while another 188 licenses valued at nearly $42 billion were greenlight for Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corp., SMIC, 0.981.HK, between November 2020 and April 2021. However, industry sources told SIZE that nearly all applications for export licenses to SMIC's most advanced facilities were typically denied after August 2021. Thus, almost the only types of sales that the December 2020 SMIC entity listing definitively blocked were for the technology that it specifically stated would be prohibited, namely extreme ultraviolet (EUV) lithography equipment, which United States companies do not principally supply. Thus, blocking EUV sales required a policy change by the Dutch government since the sole supplier of complete EUV lithography machines is a Dutch company, ASML. The Trump administration reportedly reached an informal agreement with the Dutch government in early 2020. According to a later published Dutch government document, the Dutch Ministry of Defense was a strong supporter of limiting EUV exports to China at the time. Industry sources told SIS that, at the time, ASML was poised to ship EUV tools to China and that SMIC was planning to work with key research labs in Europe such as the Inter-University Microelectronics Center, IMEC, to help develop their EUV-based manufacturing process. Blocking China from acquiring EUV technology has complicated China's path to producing chips at technology nodes more advanced than 7 nanometers. However, it actually did not block SMIC from legally acquiring all the equipment required to manufacture 7 nanometers chips, since much of the advanced deposition, etching, inspection, and metrology equipment was not blocked from purchase. Moreover, advanced deep ultraviolet (DUV) lithography equipment can be used as an alternative to EUV for the production of 7 nanometers chips. The clearest proof of this is the fact that SMIC was already producing and selling 7 nanometers chips no later than July 2022 and potentially as early as July 2021, despite having no EUV machines. TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing giant, achieved 7 nanometers mass production by 2018 without using EUV technology. Adopting EUV, however, brings benefits in production reliability, speed, scale, and therefore economic competitiveness. SMIC's initial 7 nanometers chips, using SMIC's N+1 process, were specialized chips for cryptocurrency mining. Such chips are less complicated to manufacture than a smartphone's application processor due to their lack of dense static random access (SRAM) memory. For SMIC, the barrier to making more complex 7 nanometers chips in 2021 was a need for improved operational experience and skill in using the equipment it already had to improve its 7 nanometers production process and then reliably operate it at scale, not necessarily a need for additional equipment. The Huawei chip, using SMIC's N+2 process, proves that SMIC's skill in manufacturing at the 7 nanometers node has advanced significantly since July 2022, despite the Biden administration's new semiconductor export control architecture that was launched on October 7, 2022. It is worth noting, however, that SMIC's work on N+2 has been underway at least since early 2020. Thus, much of the relevant development work took place long before October 7. Industry sources told SIS that, both before and after October 7, SMIC was the beneficiary of significant foreign technical advice, though after October 7, this advice was limited to non-US persons.
Title 2, Huawei Mate60 Pro and SMIC 7 nanometers chip implications for Biden-era export controls.
The Biden administration's October 7 export controls doubled down on the Trump administration's attempt to restrict the export of U.S. advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. However, the Biden administration went significantly further in an effort to not only restrict the pace of China's technological progress but also to, as much as possible, actively degrade the current state-of-the-art back to a pre-14 nm manufacturing level. The policy also went beyond mere entity listings and put blanket restrictions on all of China that sought to, in some instances, cut off SMIC and other advanced Chinese chipmakers from the supply of U.S. equipment, spare parts, software updates, components, maintenance, and even expert advisory services. The goal was to force existing Chinese chip manufacturers to shut down or reconfigure their advanced product lines to focus on legacy technologies. SMIC is the most advanced logic chip foundry in China, so it was absolutely a target of this policy. Technology degrading did indeed happen in the case of YMTC, which was forced to abandon, perhaps only temporarily, plans for a 232-layer NAND flash memory product. However, the Huawei Mate60 Pro demonstrates that SMIC's peak manufacturing technological capability has not only not been degraded, but it has advanced. For the Biden administration, the Mate60 Pro launch is an important data point that raises legitimate questions regarding the key assumptions underlying their signature semiconductor export control policy. Most obviously, this development suggests that the October 7 export control policy, and especially the recently updated export control policies of the Japanese and Dutch governments, were needed earlier to have a realistic opportunity to achieve all their intended effects. However, it also shows one of the key mechanisms of the policy end-use restrictions on advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment is not working as intended and will require an update to close existing loopholes. Industry experts consistently told SAIS that no combination of Chinese semiconductor manufacturing equipment companies can produce even 10% of the diverse types of advanced equipment required to operate a 7nm chip foundry. In fact, there is number 7nm fab in the world that does not rely upon controlled U.S. technology, so it is quite clear that SMIC is using U.S. technology machines, components, spare parts, and materials in producing these chips for Huawei. It is also highly likely that Huawei designed these chips using software tools from U.S. electronic design automation (EDA) companies. Huawei only announced in March 2023 that it had finally made a breakthrough on 14nm software tools after years of work. These claims have yet to be verified externally. The idea that Huawei had completed development of its more advanced 7nm EDA tools in time to design the core processors for a phone that launched in September is not consistent with typical industry chip design or EDA tool development timelines. The companies that do have mature EDA software available for designing 7nm chips are all American. Prior to Huawei's entity listing, Huawei was legally allowed to license this software from the companies and did so. That was how Huawei designed its first 7nm chip back in 2018. However, the U.S. providers of EDA software have been prohibited from renewing Huawei's software licenses or providing software updates since 2020. Industry officials told SAIS that the Huawei chip was most likely designed with a pirated version of US EDA tools. Chinese software piracy is a well-known problem in the EDA industry. Thus, the fact that Huawei and SMIC used US technology is not controversial. It is clearly the case. Determining whether Huawei and SMIC's use of US technology involved violations of US law either by those companies, by their Chinese suppliers, or by the U.S. companies that produce the technology is not quite as obvious. However, there are many suspicious circumstances that deserve immediate inquiry. The following sections of this paper will detail the regulatory mechanisms by which the October 7th export controls were intended to address the gaps in the Trump administration policy and also assess the questions that U.S. policymakers should be asking as they consider updated controls. Title 3: Analysis of existing U.S. regulatory mechanisms to prevent 7nm chip fabrication. The Trump administration took three major actions in the semiconductor sector. First, it placed entity list restrictions on hundreds of Chinese companies, including ZTE, later removed, Fujian Jinhua, Huawei, and SMIC. Second, the Trump administration adjusted the scope and application of the FDPR. Third, it persuaded the Dutch government to restrict sales of EUV machines to China as a whole based on an informal agreement to deny a license for technology that was already controlled on a multilateral basis through the Wassenaar Arrangement control list. The Biden administration did not reverse or weaken any Trump-era semiconductor trade restrictions and added to them significantly by adopting new restrictions that applied to China as a whole. Most importantly, the Biden administration's October 7, 2022, policy was focused on restricting China's access to advanced chips for AI development, but that policy significantly expanded export regulations related to semiconductor manufacturing equipment in order to prevent China from domestically producing alternatives to the advanced AI chips that the United States no longer allowed exporting. The policy's chip equipment restrictions were split into three broad categories. Point 1. Blanket prohibition of exports of a narrow set of advanced deposition equipment to all of China, as well as all parts and accessories related to that equipment. These restrictions took the form of creating a new Export Control Classification Number (ECCN) 3B090, which was restricted under a Regional Security (RS China) justification. Point 2. End-use prohibition of exports intended for use in advanced node semiconductor manufacturing or where the manufacturing node is not clear. The second major restriction was the creation of a new license restriction based on end use with a presumption of denial, by adding Section 744.23 to the Export Administration Regulations, ER. This effectively imposed a blanket ban on exports to China in cases where the exporter in question has knowledge that the exported goods will be used for a restricted end use.
The restricted end uses in question are production of advanced node semiconductors defined as logic chipset or below 16 nanometers, DRAM memory chipset or below 18 nanometers, and NAND storage at or above 128 layers or supporting Chinese production of any semiconductor manufacturing equipment, components, or parts. An additional near-blanket prohibition exists for selling to any facility in which the seller knows that the facility produces chips but does not know whether or not the chips produced at that facility are at an advanced technology node. Point 3. To ensure that shipments of U.S. technology for restricted goods, or even transfers of relevant subject matter expertise, would not occur through foreign subsidiaries, joint ventures, or partnerships, the regulations modified Section 744.6 of the EAR, the so-called U.S. Persons Rule, which dramatically expanded licensing requirements. It also applies an updated FDPR provision, Section 742.6(a)(6), to prevent foreign firms from using U.S. technology to assist China in pursuing the end uses specified in Section 744.23. These restrictions apply on a China-wide basis, though only for restricted end uses and end users. Point 4. The broader set of equipment and components restricted by Section 744.23 includes all items subject to the ER, of which ECCNs 3B001, 3B002, 3B090, 3B611, 3B991, and 3B992 directly pertain to semiconductor manufacturing equipment and components. This equipment is still generally allowed to be sold to China in cases where two criteria are met. First, the exporter must not have specific knowledge that the buyer intends to use the equipment for advanced node manufacturing. Second, the equipment must not be destined for end use at a facility in which the equipment provider does not know whether or not it is engaged in advanced node manufacturing. For the newly restricted types of chip equipment covered under 3B991 and 3B992, the exporter does not even have to apply for a license to export the goods to China in cases where the exporter has no specific knowledge that they are going toward a prohibited end use or end user. Point 5. Blanket export ban to YMTC, China's most advanced NAND company. 2 months later, in December 2022, the U.S. government also added YMTC to the entity list under a blanket presumption of denial for exporting all items subject to the EAR. Any purchase of semiconductor manufacturing equipment or components by YMTC after December 2022 would have been in some way illegal under U.S. law, unless the U.S. government had approved a license. The Biden administration adopted these new rules in an attempt to degrade the peak technology level of the Chinese chip-making sector through the loss of access to spare parts, maintenance, and advisory services. It would, for example, be illegal for any U.S. company to provide SMIC with spare parts or new equipment if the U.S. company had knowledge that SMIC was using the equipment to support its 7 nanometers manufacturing line.
In practice, this means that all shipments to SMIC's SN1 and SN2 fab facilities in Shanghai are prohibited.
For shipments to other SMIC facilities, the October 7th policy instructs companies to follow official Know Your Customer guidance and best practices, including obtaining a signed end-use statement from the customer and also evaluating all other available information to determine whether a license is required pursuant to Section 744.23. Overall, this is a significantly stricter due diligence requirement than is typical for Department of Commerce export controls, but it still raises the question of just how much leverage the U.S. government will have to punish companies that use already installed equipment for prohibited end uses. It also raises the question of whether SMIC and other Chinese firms could be deceiving U.S. firms about the true end uses of their purchases. Title 4. Why did the October 7th export controls fail to prevent SMIC from advancing 7 nanometers production? It is clear at this point that the October 7th policy has thus far failed to degrade SMIC's peak technological capability, but that is not especially surprising. SMIC had already begun a ferocious capacity expansion and equipment buying campaign both before and after its December 2020 entity listing. As noted above, the U.S. restrictions prior to October 7th did very little to limit SMIC's purchase of advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, even when that equipment was known to be directly supporting a 7 nanometers production line. SMIC had 14 nanometers fin-shaped field effect transistor, FinFET,
production commercially available in 2019 and thus had nearly all the equipment it needed to advance to 7 nanometers due to the ability to recycle the equipment for future nodes. In much the same way that Huawei had stockpiled a 2-year supply of chips prior to U.S. entity restrictions taking effect, SMIC has amassed a large number of machines and potentially also a large stockpile of spare parts that it can draw from. In recent years, Chinese semiconductor manufacturing equipment purchases have been so extensive that non-Chinese chip manufacturers have been complaining that it is delaying equipment providers from completing their non-Chinese orders on time. Industry sources told SAIS that equipment providers routinely refer to Chinese customers under the label of non-market demand, meaning that the customers were buying for strategic reasons unrelated to market conditions or profit maximization. Moreover, industry sources told SAIS that, prior to the October 7 regulations, some semiconductor manufacturing equipment, components, and spare parts from U.S. companies were exported to China without a license via foreign headquartered partners. In the absence of the application of the FDPR, or the U.S. Persons Rule, this is not necessarily a violation of U.S. law. Industry sources also told SAIS that SMIC has set up a network of shell companies and partner firms in China through which it has been able to continue acquiring U.S. equipment and components by deceiving U.S. exporters. If true, sales to such shell companies would involve violations of U.S. law by SMIC, though not necessarily by U.S. companies, so long as the U.S. firm had no knowledge of the fact that the shell company was acting on behalf of SMIC. In cases where SMIC did face a legitimate problem due to U.S. restrictions, it was, until very recently, largely unrestricted in its ability to purchase equipment and spare parts from the Netherlands, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. According to a Financial Times analysis of Chinese customs data, the total value of Chinese imports of semiconductor manufacturing equipment increased from $2.9 billion over the 2 months in June and July 2022 to $5.0 billion over the same 2 months in 2023. The analysis further found that most of the imports came from the Netherlands and Japan.
Japan's export controls only took effect in late July 2023.
The Netherlands' export controls only took effect in September, and Dutch companies are being allowed to complete the delivery of previously approved licensed exports to China even if those deliveries occur after September 2023, so long as the shipment is completed by January 1, 2024. The Chinese customs data analyzed by the Financial Times includes finished and fully integrated manufacturing equipment but does not include components, spare parts, and materials. One industry source told SAIS that, because of this omission, the customs data significantly understates the extent to which U.S. technology is being displaced by foreign suppliers. This individual said that as U.S. equipment firms have been forced to reduce their presence in the market, Japanese firms have been gorging themselves on Chinese revenue from selling fully integrated machines. Korean firms have been gorging themselves on selling subsystems and spare parts. In conversations with SAIS, multiple industry sources highlighted the problem of South Korean firms backfilling export-controlled U.S. technology and also training Chinese staff in both equipment maintenance and fab operations. In early 2021, SMIC told its Chinese government investors that its goal for the SN1 chip fab, SMIC's second most advanced facility and the one which produces 14 nanometers node wafers, was production capacity of 35,000 finished wafers per month, WPM.
SMIC's most advanced chip fab is SN2, which is part of the same SMIC Southern Shanghai campus as SN1.
SN2 is the facility where SMIC conducts advanced node research and development, R&D, and is also the facility where SMIC has begun mass production of its 7 nanometers, N+1 and N+2, processes. According to a June 2020 report by Guolian Securities, a Chinese investment advisory firm, SMIC planned for 7 nanometers production capacity at SN2 to also reach 35,000 WPM on an unspecified timeframe. According to one Chinese semiconductor industry analyst, SMIC also planned as recently as September 2022 to eventually pursue 5 nanometers production at SN2 despite lacking access to EUV machines. For comparison, TSMC first achieved 7 nanometers mass production without EUV but later upgraded its 7 nanometers process to use EUV. No major international chipmaker has ever engaged in mass production of 5 nanometers chips without using EUV lithography machines. Both the SN1 and SN2 projects were announced in 2017.
The SN1 facility was producing 3,000 WPM in late 2019, 6,000 WPM at the 14 nanometers node in June 2020, and in February 2021 SMIC claimed that SN1 had achieved 15,000 WPM production capacity by the end of 2020. According to a SMIC press release in early 2020, SMIC had originally anticipated hitting the 35,000 WPM production target for SN1 by the end of 2022.
More likely than not, SMIC has by now hit this SN1 production capacity target.
SMIC stated in February 2023 that it would accelerate capacity expansion despite weakening demand and market oversupply.
DG Times Asia reported in June 2023 that SMIC was continuing to offer and deliver 14 nanometers production to customers.
One industry source told SIZE that SMIC's FinFET production capacity across both SN1 and SN2 is currently 35,000 WPM and that roughly one-third of this capacity is currently being devoted to 7 nanometers production. No data is publicly available on SN2's progress in production capacity ramp-up. T.P. Huang, an independent semiconductor industry analyst, estimates that by the end of 2023, SMIC will have legally acquired enough advanced DUV lithography machines across all SMIC facilities to eventually support production of more than 50,000 FinFET WPM, which would have to be split across the 14 nanometers and 7 nanometers production.
It is unclear what share of these machines currently resides at SN1 and SN2. Based on analysis of a SMIC notice, Huang projects that all SN2 equipment installations will be completed by July 2024. Industry sources told SIZE that this estimate is reasonable and that SMIC will likely reach production capacity of 50,000 WPM across SN1 and SN2 by the end of 2024.
SMIC has existing customers for its 14 nanometers capacity, so presumably it will not immediately reallocate all of its machines to 7 nanometers. In lithography, the Dutch export controls only restrict exports of EUV machines and the most advanced DUV machines, so it is possible that additional future purchases could increase SMIC's potential 7 nanometers production even beyond 50,000 WPM. For most new semiconductor manufacturers, manufacturing yield, the share of the chips on the finished wafer that are usable, starts at a low level and then improves as the company's mastery of a new technology node and production process improves.
Industry sources told SIZE that SMIC's current yield is roughly 50%.
By comparison, TSMC's early production with 7 nanometers was already achieving 76% yield in 2017, even before introducing EUV technology. It is reasonable to assume that SMIC's yield will improve over time, as more of ASML's most advanced DUV lithography machines are delivered and as SMIC gains operational experience with the N+2 process node.
However, SMIC may never match the high yields that TSMC achieved after introducing EUV.
The yield rate directly relates to the economics of chip production. Costs are incurred on a per-wafer basis, so increasing the number of usable chips per wafer is equivalent to increasing output without increasing costs. Per-chip costs are not typically made publicly available, but Fomalhaut Techno Solutions, a Tokyo-based research company, estimated in 2022 that Apple paid TSMC $110 per chip for its 4 nanometers production, up from $46 per chip for TSMC's 5 nanometers production.
TSMC's 5 nanometers production process, which used EUV, reportedly achieved excellent yields early in its history.
If SMIC hypothetically had 100% yield and 35,007 nanometers WPM production capacity at SN2 with 550 Huawei chips per wafer, then SMIC could produce enough chips for 231 million phones over the course of a year. As mentioned previously, Huawei only expects to sell 60 million such phones in 2024. This is no doubt exactly what Huawei hopes for, to win back the customers it lost to Apple and other competitors during the years it was cut off from 5G chips. The Chinese government's instructions to all employees of the Chinese government and all state-owned enterprises not to use Apple phones might soon be followed by nationalist pressure to buy Huawei's alternative, even if the technical performance is inferior. If SMIC's yield remains low,
Huawei's 5G smartphone business may require significant subsidization or a protected domestic market to be economically viable. Assuming that Huawei is paying SMICs per wafer prices comparable to what Apple paid TSMC for 7 nanometers capacity $10,000 per wafer, then $4.2 billion in annual subsidies would be enough to pay for Huawei buying the entirety of SMIC's annual 7 nanometers production, assuming 35,000 WPM. Smartphone companies tend to be early adopters of new semiconductor technology nodes. If the production capacity was directed not toward phones but other uses, such as manufacturing AI chips, which tend to be far larger, then SMIC could manufacture perhaps 10 million per year even at low yields. AI chips tend to be much larger and thus put more of their production investment at risk from manufacturing defects. AI chip producers tend to adopt a manufacturing process node roughly 2 years after the smartphone early adopters because by that time the defect rate has come down considerably. Further analysis of the implications of this chip for China's AI sector is included later in this report. It is currently unclear based on the available information whether or not SMIC has also benefited from illegal technology purchases made in violation of the October 7th or other U.S. export controls. Dylan Patel, Afzal Ahmad, and Myron Xie of the semiconductor consulting firm SemiAnalysis have argued forcefully, however, that this is indeed the case. Their provocative claims are worth quoting at length. The equipment companies such as Applied Materials, Lam Research, Tokyo Electron, KLA, Screen, ASM International, Kokusai, etc. are selling basically every tool they offer to China. This is because most deposition, etch, metrology, cleaning, coaters, developers, ion implant, epitaxy, etc. tools for 7 nanometers and even 5 nanometers can also plausibly be used in 28 nanometers. These tools are being sold to SMIC for 28 nanometers, but, in reality, SMIC is lying to the firm's faces and using them for 7 nanometers. While SMIC is expanding 28 nanometers and other trailing edge nodes, it is much less than they claim as these tools are being rerouted to leading edge. It's even possible that people within these equipment firms know what's happening, but are turning a blind eye. The SemiAnalysis authors did not specifically disclose the sources for these claims in their article but elsewhere cited rumors from China. One industry source told SIZE that illegal diversion of U.S. exports in materials and spare parts to prohibited Chinese end uses and end users was rampant even after October 7, 2022, and that the end-use controls outlined in Section 744.23 were being intentionally violated by SMIC and other advanced Chinese chip manufacturers. Other industry sources told SIZE that rumors of diversion at the fully integrated equipment level were entirely false and that diversion at the subsystem and part levels was done by third parties, not U.S. firms. These accusations may or may not be true, and there has been no proof provided to verify or disprove the accusations. Nevertheless, they deserve immediate investigation by the U.S. government. If exports are being diverted from their legally licensed destination toward fabs that are operating toward prohibited end uses, that is strong legal justification for the U.S. government and its allies to strengthen export control restrictions. It is at a minimum plausible that SMIC's claims to be expanding capacity at 28 nanometers are disingenuous. Other Chinese chip-making companies have built fabs with the explicit intention of starting production at 28 nanometers and later shifting production to more advanced technology nodes. In February 2021, a Chinese news outlet reported that SMIC's Huahong Factory No. 6 in Shanghai would begin production at 28 nanometers but that SMIC ultimately planned to upgrade the facility to 14 nanometers with a production capacity of 40,000 WPM. However, SMIC does have a large and growing set of customers for 28 nanometers production, so this transition to 7 nanometers, even if planned, may be well in the future. Title 5: Impacts of Export Controls on China's Chipmaking and Chip Equipment Industries. However, even if there are legal grounds for expanded export controls, the U.S. government must have a clear sense of what effect strengthened export controls are realistically going to have and how the United States would know whether or not its efforts are succeeding. YMTC is the clearest test case for the power of unilateral U.S. semiconductor export controls against Chinese chipmakers. With a blanket export ban adopted in December 2022,
YNTC's entity list restrictions are far stronger than anything that the United States placed on SMIC or included in the October 7 regulations. Reporting by the Financial Times and South China Morning Post claims that YNTC was initially hit hard by the controls, but that a combination of government subsidies, Dutch and Japanese equipment, previously purchased U.S. equipment, and the improving quality of Chinese equipment suppliers has given YNTC the confidence to restart advanced NAND memory production and make major investments. It is worth emphasizing again that YNTC had been extensively preparing for U.S. export controls since 2019, 3.5 years before the time they arrived. Furthermore, YNTC will have arguably had more than 4.5 years of preparation by the time Dutch controls take full effect in January 2024. At the same time, China's domestic semiconductor equipment sector is experiencing significant growth and collectively organizing itself around the goal of producing alternatives to U.S. equipment, components, and spare parts. Analysis by Sino Research, a Chinese consultancy, finds that the 10 largest Chinese semiconductor manufacturing equipment firms have seen their revenue increase 39% compared with 2022, totaling $2.2 billion for the first half of 2023.
This builds on progress that was already underway even before October 2022.
Dr. Doug Fuller of the Copenhagen Business School claims that Chinese semiconductor equipment firms have increased their share of China's domestic market from 8.5% in 2020 to 25% in the first 10 months of 2022, though these sales were overwhelmingly concentrated at legacy nodes and far from the state-of-the-art.
Chinese equipment firms are also concentrated in non-critical processes. Moreover, after October 7, the Chinese government has further increased its already massive subsidization of the semiconductor industry.
In September, Reuters reported that China is preparing to launch a new $40 billion state-backed investment fund for its semiconductor sector.
This follows similarly massive funds launched in 2014 and 2019.
On September 18, 2023, the Chinese government strengthened R&D tax incentives such that 120% of the cost of all R&D by Chinese semiconductor companies can now be deducted from taxes. The semiconductor industry is among the most R&D-intensive industries worldwide, so this is a massive subsidy stacked on top of many other massive subsidies that remain in effect. The Dutch and Japanese export controls are a license requirement with unclear, at least in terms of publicly available information, license approval criteria. It is possible that the Dutch and Japanese licensing restrictions will be enforced similarly to the U.S. framework, which applies extremely broad restrictions for the advanced fabs such as the one that YNTC is building. If that is indeed the case, YNTC will be cut off from nearly every foreign machine that it needs to build and maintain its advanced fab legally.
Whether or not illegal means are available will depend upon the strength of enforcement capacity.
However, it is worth asking whether or not Dutch or Japanese export controls can be truly effective in the absence of Dutch and Japanese legal equivalents to the U.S. FDPR and U.S. Persons Rule. The absence of such provisions has been a challenge for earlier Japanese export controls. Most notably, a recent World Bank analysis of Japan's 2019 export controls on the sale of semiconductor manufacturing chemicals to South Korea found that Japanese chemical suppliers responded by simply shifting some production of the chemicals from Japan to their subsidiary companies headquartered in South Korea or by forming joint ventures with South Korean firms.
This was not in legal violation of Japanese export controls, though it was obviously in violation of the policy's intent.
If sales and shipments of Dutch and Japanese equipment, components, and spare parts are simply routed through foreign subsidiaries or distributors, then the export controls will have limited effect on China's ability to expand advanced node production. Many Dutch and Japanese business executives will likely use all legal means available to continue sales to China. At least one Japanese business executive has already stated his intention to develop duplicate supply chains, one for the US-led economic bloc and one for the China-led bloc.
One industry source told SAIS that we're definitely seeing the Chinese equipment industry making progress faster than previously expected.
the degree of dominance of U.S. firms in certain categories of semiconductor manufacturing equipment at the fully integrated systems level is real, but that is as the manager of a global supply chain in which other countries provide many components and subsystems that make up important parts of the finished system. Industry sources told SAIS that Chinese semiconductor equipment companies have worked aggressively to map U.S. equipment firms' supply chains and to develop independent purchasing relationships with U.S. equipment companies' non-U.S. suppliers. Because Chinese semiconductor equipment and component firms have already been subject to blanket U.S. export controls and have weak prospects for sales outside of China, they have little incentive to respect U.S. intellectual property, export controls, or other laws. Thus, these firms take advantage of non-U.S. suppliers where they can and seek to reverse engineer U.S. or allied technology where they must. One Chinese equipment company, AMEC, claimed at an August 2023 investor relations meeting that they have 35 different types of etching equipment tools under development that are designed to provide full coverage of the etching processes required for manufacturing sub-20 nm drum memory. Of these 35, AMEC claims that 14 of the tools are already in mass production, while the other 21 have completed laboratory verification. An industry source told SAIS that AMEC's tools that have completed laboratory verification are 2 to 5 years away from being viable for mass production under ideal conditions, and that the actual time to availability may be longer. Regardless, this still represents significant progress from where AMEC was 3 years ago. As mentioned above, AMEC is part of China's new approach of centralizing collaboration between the Chinese government and leading private sector semiconductor firms, a collaboration led by Huawei. Industry sources also told SAIS that South Korean, European, and Japanese subsystems suppliers are aggressively pursuing the Chinese market that has been opened up in the wake of U.S. export controls. Two sources specifically stated that South Korean firms have been instrumental in providing spare parts, maintenance, and advisory services related to U.S. equipment. YMTC likewise has little incentive to comply with U.S. laws. As long as sales of components and materials are continuing through distributors in China, genuinely cutting YMTC off will be difficult unless the United States and its allies are willing to tighten restrictions on a China-wide basis. One industry expert told SAIS that the Department of Commerce has failed to effectively identify all the shell companies and industry partners that YMTC uses to continue receiving U.S. technology in violation of export controls. Multiple industry sources said the same was true of SMIC. CMXT, a Chinese drum memory producer, is reportedly spending hundreds of millions of dollars to purchase legacy equipment suitable for producing large quantities of legacy drum that is less advanced than the performance specifications in the October 7th controls. If CMXT's intentions are sincere, then this is arguably a success story for the October 7th policy, since CMXT had previously been planning to expand advanced node capacity. However, one industry analyst told SAIS that the composition of equipment purchases by CMXT is inconsistent with an intention of producing legacy drum chips and would make far more sense if CMXT's true intention was to produce chips more advanced than those prohibited by the October 7th end-use controls. If true, this would suggest that CMXT is deceiving U.S. companies and regulators in order to amass a stockpile of U.S. equipment that will at some point be redirected to restricted end uses. Another industry source told SAIS that CMXT is open with its Dutch and Japanese equipment suppliers about its intention to produce chips more advanced than those allowed under U.S. export controls. The October 7th export controls, and especially the Dutch and Japanese restrictions, were too late to prevent SMIC from bringing online a facility that will likely soon achieve 35,000 WPM of 7 nanometers production capacity with decent, if not world-leading, yield. This is a genuine threat to U.S. and allied national security, not least because of what it likely means for the Chinese military's access to domestically produced AI chips. The highest levels of leadership in both the United States and China, including Xi Jinping, believe that leading in AI technology is critical to the future of global military and economic power. In May 2023, a group of AI industry and academic leaders issued a statement warning that the risks of advanced AI should be viewed in the same way as pandemics and nuclear war. None of those risks will be any easier to manage if China achieves its vision of becoming an AI-enabled authoritarian superpower. Title 6,
potential implications for China's AI and AI chip sector. Huawei's new chip and 5G phone attracted the bulk of the media attention during and after Secretary Raimondo's August 2023 visit to China. However, the more strategically important disclosure related to Huawei's progress on AI chips. On August 27, the chairman of iFlyTek, one of China's largest and most technologically sophisticated AI companies, said at a conference that I am particularly happy to tell you that Huawei's GPU capabilities are now the same as NVIDIA's A100. Huawei CEO, Ren Zhengfei attaches great importance to it, and 3 directors of Huawei have gone to work in iFlyTek at KUST, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology.
Now they have benchmarked against NVIDIA's A100, Google Automated Translation.
In short, at the same time that Huawei was announcing its return to the 5G smartphone market, it was also announcing its return to the GPU, also known as AI chip, market. In contrast to more general-purpose processors, AI chips are specially designed to increase speed and reduce the power consumption of developing, referred to in the industry as training, and operationally using, referred to as inference, machine learning AI models.
Huawei has sold AI accelerator chips under its Ascend product line since 2019. These chips were designed by HiSilicon and manufactured by TSMC. This halted in May 2020 after the first Huawei FDPR rule. However, Huawei was rumored to have amassed a major stockpile of these chips, allowing the company to continue winning major data center contracts across China. Independent testing by Chinese university scholars in September 2022 found that Huawei's Ascend chips were inferior to Western competitor products, most notably NVIDIA, on nearly all performance metrics related to chip design and hardware. However, in the case of NVIDIA, its competitive dominance is based not only on the performance of its chips but also on the strength of the software ecosystem that is based upon NVIDIA standards, particularly NVIDIA's CUDA software ecosystem. CUDA makes it much easier for programmers to write massively parallelized software, as all modern AI software is, and ensures backward and forward compatibility so that older chips can still run newer software and vice versa. Any customer who seeks to stop using NVIDIA chips has to leave the CUDA ecosystem, which requires solving a lot of incredibly hard software problems for which CUDA already provides free answers. Those free answers reflect billions of dollars of investment in the CUDA platform by both NVIDIA and its customers. The strength of the combined offering of CUDA software and NVIDIA hardware goes a long way toward explaining why NVIDIA accounted for 95% of AI chip sales in China in 2022, according to estimates by Fubon Securities Investment Services. Even in 2019, Huawei's strategy for competing with NVIDIA in the AI chip hardware market included creating a software alternative to CUDA, which Huawei refers to as its Compute Architecture for Neural Networks, CAN. According to Huawei, CAN is not only a software platform, but also a development system that includes a programming language, compilation and debugging tools, and programming models. CAN creates a programming framework based on Ascend AI processors.
Huawei claimed in September 2022 that Ascend and CAN were generating traction. More than 900,000 developers have launched more than 1,100 AI solutions based on Ascend, which are widely used in government, telecommunications, finance, electricity, internet, and other fields. iFlyTek is one AI firm that has close ties to the Chinese government, including developing AI technologies used in the surveillance and repression of China's Uyghur minority. For this reason, iFlyTek was placed on the U.S. Entity List in 2019. iFlyTek is therefore a natural target customer for Huawei's AI chips, since its access to U.S. alternatives is restricted.
Prior to the entity listing, iFlyTek primarily used NVIDIA products.
More recently, Huawei claimed in July 2023 that the number of Ascend and CAN developers has doubled to 1.8 million.
It is unclear how Huawei is measuring the number of Ascend and CAN developers or how active an average Ascend developer is.
For comparison, NVIDIA said in May 2023 that CUDA has 4 million active developers and that CUDA has been downloaded more than 40 million times, including 25 million times in just the past year. Despite the October 2022 export controls, NVIDIA's chips that are legally approved for export to the Chinese market, the A800 and H800, are reportedly in high demand by Chinese hyperscale cloud computing vendors. The A800 and H800 are degraded versions of the A100 and H100 chips, respectively. Specifically, the A800 and H800 have equivalent processing power to their non-degraded counterparts but significantly reduced interconnect speed that is below the export control thresholds. NVIDIA's A100 models, launched in 2020, are manufactured by TSMC on their 7nm process, while its H100 models, launched in 2022, use a custom TSMC 4nm process node. NVIDIA has not announced the release date for its forthcoming B100 product line, but it will reportedly use TSMC's 3nm process node in launch in either late 2024 or early 2025. All of this suggests that even NVIDIA's products that are degraded to comply with export controls will be more attractive than Huawei's alternatives for at least the next few years. Huawei and SMIC do not have a clear path to producing chips beyond the 5nm node, and SMIC will likely have poor unit economics to produce 5nm chips without access to EUV technology. The greater maturity of the CUDA software ecosystem also makes NVIDIA chips more attractive. However, if the performance thresholds specified in the October 7th export controls are held constant, then the attractiveness of NVIDIA products compared with Huawei alternatives could change significantly in the future. The current performance penalty for training large AI models with the degraded NVIDIA chips is reportedly in the range of 10 to 30%. This is significant, but able to be overcome by Chinese AI firms that benefit from both government subsidies and a protected domestic market. Industry sources told SAIS that the performance penalty will grow over time as the consequences of capped interconnect speed become more and more pronounced. This could potentially mean that Huawei chips, which would obviously not comply with interconnect speed restrictions, could have superior overall performance even if they are manufactured on an inferior semiconductor process node. Moreover, there are other sources of improvement to chip performance besides adopting a superior manufacturing process node. NVIDIA's chief scientist Bill Daly recently said that of the 1,000-fold performance improvement that AI model training on NVIDIA chips has undergone over the past 10 years, semiconductor manufacturing process node improvements were only the third most important factor. More specifically, he said that process node improvements had delivered a 2.5 times performance boost between the 28nm node and 5nm node. This suggests that even if export controls were able to effectively constrain China's AI development to the 28nm node as was their original intent, there are limits to how much export controls on NVIDIA and related firms can degrade the performance of US AI chips before Chinese firms will make an economically rational choice to buy domestic alternatives, such as those designed by Huawei, Biren, or Cambricon. Chinese AI firms would likely prefer a 28nm Chinese chip over a 7nm US chip if the US chip's interconnect speed limitations degrade AI model training performance more than the use of an older node degrades the Chinese chip's performance. However, the 28nm target might now be out of reach, unless the United States and its allies are willing to engage in dramatically more aggressive restrictions. If SMIC is able to build out Chinese domestic availability of 7nm production capacity with adequate reliability and yield, that would significantly accelerate the timeframe in which Chinese AI development firms such as Alibaba and Baidu might find Huawei chips attractive in comparison to those of NVIDIA. There are, of course, significant switching costs to leaving the CUDA ecosystem. Along with the Chinese government and its corporate partners, Huawei is now engaged in a project to build a Chinese computing ecosystem that is entirely independent of the United States. The list of projects that Huawei and its partners have underway at varying levels of maturity is extraordinary. It includes at a minimum the following: EDA chip design software, chip manufacturing equipment, chip manufacturing facilities, chip designs for personal computers, smartphones, and data centers, AI chip enablement software ecosystems, AI software development frameworks, AI models, computer and smartphone software operating systems, computer, smartphone, and data center hardware systems, and cloud computing. In much the same way that one of the first major initial uses of the Chinese yuan currency for international trade transactions was avoiding US sanctions, the initial customer base for Huawei's alternative AI computing ecosystem is sanctioned and entity-listed actors in China. That may soon grow to include other countries such as Russia and Iran.
Within China, entity-listed firms and government agencies comprise a larger and more technologically sophisticated customer base than is commonly understood in Western policy circles. iFlyTech, for example, has routinely published research papers at leading international AI conferences. Even after being sanctioned, iFlyTech has 40% market share in China's automotive voice recognition market. Beyond the Chinese domestic market, the other critical market for Huawei's technology stack is exports, especially to the global south. Title 7, the need for timely U.S. intelligence collection and technology analysis on China's semiconductors. Perhaps the most surprising fact about the Huawei breakthrough is that so many U.S. government leaders were evidently surprised. Asked about the chip on September 6, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan stated that I'm going to withhold comment on the particular chip in question until we get more information about precisely its character and composition. Similarly, a group of Republican members of Congress wrote a letter to Department of Commerce leadership in which they expressed being extremely troubled and perplexed by what the Huawei phone suggests about the efficacy of U.S. export controls. None of these statements give confidence that these U.S. leaders in either the White House or Congress are receiving good intelligence about the state of China's quest for semiconductor self-sufficiency. If this is indeed the case, it is simply unacceptable. It is possible, of course, that the U.S. intelligence community has more answers than the U.S. government is making public. The October 7 export controls were one of the most important foreign policy moves that the Biden administration adopted in 2022, perhaps second only to supporting Ukraine against the Russian invasion. Senior U.S. national security and foreign policy leaders need to know to what extent that policy is having the intended effect, and they need to learn that before China rubs it in a U.S. cabinet secretary's face during a trip to China. The Huawei phone and SMIC chip were not well-kept secrets. Reports of Huawei returning to the 5G market with that SMIC-manufactured 7nm chip were already widespread enough in July of this year that Chinese industry executives were publicly commenting on it. Hopefully, this incident merely reflects a failure of the relevant information to reach U.S. leaders and not a genuine gap in the capabilities of the U.S. intelligence community. During the Cold War, the U.S. intelligence community produced exceptionally good analyses of the Soviet semiconductor industry and the effectiveness of U.S. semiconductor export controls. Today, there are a host of critical questions about the Chinese semiconductor industry and the effectiveness of U.S. export controls where the U.S. intelligence community needs to supply senior U.S. decision-makers with timely intelligence. Here is just a sample. Point 1. Are SMIC or CMXT deceiving U.S. semiconductor equipment companies when they claim that post-October 7 equipment purchases are going to be exclusively used for production less advanced than the October 7 technology thresholds? Point 2. How much advanced chip production capacity does SMIC intend to build out? At what technology nodes will this occur and over what time frame? Point 3. Does the Chinese government intend to pressure Chinese businesses and consumers to purchase Huawei smartphones and chips, and not to purchase U.S. alternatives, in order to drive economies of scale? If so, what will be the likely costs to U.S. firms in terms of lost sales? Point 4. How are SMIC and YMTC getting spare parts to continue operating their advanced node U.S. equipment? Are they illegally diverting U.S. exports via shell companies or other tactics? Are they being supplied by foreign firms that manufacture viable alternatives? Or are there Chinese companies with adequate technology to supply them? Point 5. Are reports that YMTC is close to restarting advanced production with improved Chinese domestic equipment alternatives true? Is YMTC also benefiting from equipment and components acquired in violation of U.S. export controls? Point 6. How much technological progress have domestic Chinese equipment makers made, and in what areas? How much foreign help are they receiving, and from what sources? Point 7. What level of Chinese government subsidization are Huawei and SMIC specifically receiving to support their advanced node manufacturing? Do the firms have a credible path to profitable 7nm products without government support? Is the Chinese government prepared to sustain or increase this support indefinitely? Point 8.
how has China's crackdown on foreign consulting firms impacted the ability of U.S. compliance companies to engage in substantive due diligence prior to selling to Chinese companies? Title 8, Conclusion, The Future of Export Controls. Limiting China's access to advanced AI chips is a highly desirable national security outcome. However, given the flaws and long timelines for how the Trump and Biden administrations have pursued export control policies, it is difficult to see how the United States could degrade China's current technological state-of-the-art without dramatically expanding export controls and significantly increasing resources devoted to identifying and patching loopholes and strictly enforcing violations. It is not clear, for example, that even a complete entity listing of SMIC with presumption of denial for all products would cause the SN1 and SN2 fabs to shut down. With the current staffing and budget given to the Department of Commerce for export controls, there are reasons to doubt that the U.S. government can identify shell companies at the rate that Huawei, SMIC, and their partners can create them. Only China-wide restrictions imposed simultaneously and without advance notice by the United States, Japan, and the Netherlands on multiple categories of exports, especially raw materials, would have a clear path to shutting down the SMIC fabs. If SMIC has indeed been engaged in a massive campaign of export control evasion and has been providing false information to U.S. firms for their export license applications, then the case for such an option is stronger. It would provide strong evidence that China is already sprinting full out toward its own strategy for semiconductor decoupling without the slightest care of complying with U.S. law or preserving room for reaching an understanding with the United States. In such a case, the United States might conclude that it is better for semiconductor decoupling to happen when it is inconvenient for China rather than wait for China to do it when it is more convenient and on China's terms. But it will likely be more difficult to persuade U.S. allies to go along with such extreme measures if SMIC's achievement has been done entirely or almost entirely through equipment purchases made in full compliance with U.S. law. What if SMIC has simply been exploiting legal loopholes in the Trump administration approach and taking advantage of the Biden administration's very slow onboarding of Japan and the Netherlands? What if SMIC is sincere in its statements that the massive expansion of fab capacity that it is bringing online will exclusively be used for 28 nanometers production? U.S. allies will be more willing to restrict the actions of their companies and citizens if they understand the evidence of reverse engineering and illegal purchases of equipment, as well as how China's plans are not in their own national interest. This underscores the need for timely and high-quality intelligence. There are other aspects of this story where SMIC could be in violation of U.S. law besides whether SMIC's post-October 2022 equipment purchases were intended for 7 nanometers manufacturing. The FDPR as applied to Huawei has thus far restricted the ability of firms that use U.S. equipment to produce chips on behalf of Huawei, regardless of when that equipment was purchased. The rule, as written, also includes coverage of more than exports, including in-country transfers, such as the SMIC sale of chips to Huawei. A group of U.S. members of Congress sent a letter to the Department of Commerce directly alleging that SMIC's production on behalf of Huawei was in violation of U.S. export controls. As mentioned above, this does indeed seem to be the case. The U.S. government's response will have to take this into account. After all, if the United States fails to respond to export control violations by Chinese entities, firms in Taiwan, South Korea, Europe, and elsewhere will feel they are being unfairly treated when the U.S. government requires them to comply.
One area where it makes obvious sense to expand restrictions is in preventing U.S. and allied companies from supporting the maturation of Chinese equipment and component companies. There is little strategic sense in allowing U.S. and allied companies to help China to prepare for decoupling with the United States and its allies. It is not in South Korea's national interest, for example, for South Korean equipment and spare parts firms to aid China's equipment indigenization effort. Nor is it in South Korea's interest to allow South Korean consultants to train Chinese engineers on how to improve the yields of their memory production fabs. Both of these will inevitably be used to break South Korea's leadership in semiconductor manufacturing. Similarly, the United States and its allies need to crack down on third-party sales of spare parts and components. In the absence of good intelligence, however, the United States will continue to be faced with an undesirable choice between taking strong action early enough to have an impact, but in a way that might seem premature or unjustified to allies, or on the other hand waiting until the justification is clear, at which point it might be too late to have an impact in the wake of Chinese equipment stockpiling and indigenization campaigns. This is the same unattractive choice that the United States has faced again and again since the Trump administration began using semiconductor export controls as a tool of foreign policy in 2018. Thus far, the United States has chosen repeatedly to enact export controls that are threatening enough to incentivize Chinese firms to stockpile and to de-Americanize their supply chains, but not strongly enough written or enforced to prevent China from succeeding in their indigenization and stockpiling efforts. The United States has incurred essentially all of the costs of an aggressive export control policy toward China, but it has done so in a way that does not provide all the potential strategic benefits of actually constraining China's future technological capabilities. The US and allied approach does appear to have limited China's access to nodes more advanced than 7 nanometers in economically competitive terms and more advanced than 5 nanometers in absolute terms. It is possible that China's extremely expensive efforts to indigenize everything will prove to be a strategic error, forcing China's government to perpetually subsidize an often corrupt semiconductor industry that produces products that are uncompetitive in Chinese or global markets. Such was the case with the Soviet semiconductor industry. However, it is also possible that China's domestic champions will ultimately achieve some degree of financial sustainability, driven by partially or fully protected sales in the large Chinese home market as well as successful exports abroad. Such was the case with China's automotive and solar cell manufacturing industries. Imposing these costs upon China is not without strategic value, both in terms of slowing its military development and in preserving U.S. technological leadership. Ben Thompson of Stratacarry argues that China's obsession with achieving 7 nanometers production in violation of U.S. export controls may actually slow China's overall technological development. Every year that China stays banging its head on the wall at 7 nanometers instead of focusing on moving down the learning curve from a fully indigenous 0.13 micron process to 90 nanometers to 65 nanometers to 40 nanometers to 28 nanometers to 22 nanometers to 16 nanometers to 10 nanometers to 7 nanometers is another year that China doesn't break the 5 nanometers barrier. In a similar argument, Bloomberg's Tim Culpen argued that the Huawei chip shows that U.S. curbs are porous, not useless. Still, this will be an unsatisfying outcome for those who hope for more from the October 7th policy. Export controls as a tool rarely deliver perfect solutions, especially not with regards to countries as large and technologically advanced as China. To the extent that export controls worked against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, it was because there was so little economic engagement between the camps to begin with and because they were so broadly enforced. To the extent that export controls worked after the Cold War, it was because the aims were quite limited and because even governments that could agree on little else could agree that they were opposed to terrorists and rogue states acquiring nuclear weapons. Trying to draw neat export control lines that achieve ideal and durable technological outcomes for dual-use technologies in the US-China relationship is significantly more difficult. Broader controls, especially multilateral ones, have a better chance of success, but the political coordination and enforcement challenges are still difficult. The United States has imposed significant costs upon China, but not so significant that they have changed the Chinese government's position on issues such as military AI development, human rights violations, sanctions violations, or intellectual property theft. Rather than change its ways, China is now spending hundreds of billions of dollars to decouple itself from multiple parts of the U.S. semiconductor and related technology ecosystem. Beginning in 2018, the United States has imposed costs upon China that are severe enough to persuade China to accelerate the indigenization of its semiconductor supply chain, but the United States and its allies have not, at least thus far, implemented export controls that are tight enough and multilateral enough to definitively prevent China from succeeding in indigenizing. Previously, the United States allowed Huawei to stockpile U.S. chips before cutting Huawei off. More recently, the United States has allowed Chinese chip fabs to stockpile U.S., Dutch, and Japanese equipment before imposing broad restrictions on the sale of such equipment. Even now, China is still acquiring significant technology and know-how from South Korean and other firms. These are all enormous shifts underway,
and the future is far from certain. What is clear, however, is that the existing export controls need to be expanded to include South Korea, Germany, and ideally the entire European Union. It is also clear that U.S. allies need to strengthen their export control regimes to be effective, which means creating legal authorities that restrict knowledge transfers and the actions of overseas subsidiaries. Finally, it is clear that all allied governments need improved intelligence and improved economic and technological analytic capacity as well as improved export control enforcement capacity. Even though export controls are central to U.S. foreign policy toward both Russia and China, Congress is now poised to deny the Department of Commerce's Export Controls Bureau its meager request for funds needed to keep a flat budget after accounting for inflation. This is, in real dollar terms, a budget cut and a shocking error given how much of U.S. national security and economic security now depends upon the efficacy of the U.S. export control system. Even if the future will often be foggy, the U.S. government must be willing to invest heavily in an improved ability to see clearly and to act effectively.